think I'll correct myself. I don't usually win things. I always win things in my second year.
After dropping one of the coldest quotes in football history and backing it up with a European trophy, Ange Postecoglou was fired as the manager of Tottenham Hotspur. But regardless of if you think it was the correct or incorrect decision, it does look like Thomas Frank will be taking his place. So in today's video, I'm going to explain why Thomas Frank is the perfect managerial appointment for Spurs and what he will bring to the club. So when talking about Thomas Frank, I think it's important to mention how well he does on a tight budget. Last season in the Premier League, Brentford had the second lowest wage budget out of the entire division, and only Ipswich Town had a lower budget than Brentford, which just goes to show how well he does on a tight budget, because we ended up finishing the season in 10th and also making a good push for Europe. Under Daniel Levy, Thomas Frank's not really going to be given that much money to play with in terms of transfers. He's going to be given more than if he was at Brentford, but still not that much compared to if other managers were to come into the club and expect, a big statement signings. Thomas Frank's not really going to expect that, and at the end of the day, he's probably not going to get that either. So that just goes to show how good he can be under a smaller budget. But also, he's very adaptable. In his first 3 seasons in the Premier League, when coming up against the traditional Big Six, he played a back 5 formation, a 5-3-2 or a 3-5-2 formation, and it worked very well, particularly in his second season in the division, the 22-23 season, where no team took more points off the Big Six than Brentford did. Now, it just goes to show again just how adaptable he is, because this season, the 2024-25 season, he changed that again. He noticed that the season before it wasn't really working against the Big Six clubs because we didn't have proper fullbacks, so he changed it. We no longer play the back 5 formation against Big Six clubs. We go into every game with either a 4-3-3 or a 4-2-3-1 formation. And again, it works very well, because this season, particularly in the latter half of the season, we've taken points off Arsenal and Manchester City and also the likes of Chelsea. So it works well, and when it doesn't work, Thomas Frank changes it. I think one of the biggest questions, though, is how will he cope managing in the Champions League, and also how will he cope taking over from a manager that gave most Spurs fans, particularly the younger generation of Spurs fans, one of the best nights of their life when they beat Manchester United in the Europa League final. Well, we'll get on to the first part. How will he cope in the Champions League? There's no real way of knowing, because he's never really had to deal with those consistent midweek matches. The fact he's got a much bigger squad will obviously help that. With Brentford, the squad depth isn't really that big, and if you lose players in certain positions, like in the fullback areas where we did a couple of seasons ago, which didn't really recover from it, and we ended up going an entire season and even an entire year without proper fullbacks until recently, where they both come back fit, and then we've obviously signed the likes of Michael Chiode. So at Spurs, he's not really going to have to worry about that. Despite the fact Spurs went through a really bad injury crisis last season, they still had some top players out on the pitch each week, and obviously you add in a couple more players to certain positions, they will be looking pretty fine. How will he cope, though, with taking over from Ange? And I think that's the biggest thing that Brent fans talk about, is the fact that he's going into a club where it already feels like half the fan base is against him. And it's not just because it's Thomas Frank, it's because he's taken over from Ange. And that's probably what hurts me most as a Brentford fan. But I do hope that Spurs fans do welcome him into the club, because I do think he will do a very good job. Now, I have had a look at the Spurs squad and the starting lineup, and I've highlighted 2 positions in particular that I personally think Thomas Frank will look to upgrade in, and that's the goalkeeper and the defensive midfield position. The goalkeeper, Vicario, is a very good shot stopper. I know Spurs fans will be saying that, but his distribution is not great, and Thomas Frank, he kind of needs a goalkeeper that has good distribution. If you look at our last 2 goalkeepers, David Raya and Mark Flecken, both notoriously great with their feet, and if you look at the way that Brentford play so often, a lot of the times our passes go back through the goalkeeper. If our attacks are breaking down, they're not really working, we go back to the goalkeeper and start again. Whereas with Vicario, it's probably not really going to work like that. So I do expect Spurs to either have another goalkeeper like Antonio Kinski. I'm not too sure how good he is with his distribution. Spurs fans will have to tell me. But I know that Vicario is not the best. So I do think that's a position they will look at. Now, as for defensive midfield, they do have a couple of good players at the club already. Players like Yves Bissouma and Rodrigo Bentancur. But neither of them really fit the mould as what a Christian Norgard has done, which is a dual winner and someone who gets a lot of tackles each match. So I do think that's another position that Spurs will probably look to invest in, and a name that has been linked already is João Paulinho, who kind of is the perfect fit for that. And the rumours are he's going to be available for like 25 million. That could be an absolute steal if Spurs can go for him. So let's look at how I think Thomas Frank will line up next season as the Spurs manager and what he will bring to the club. So in goal, I've gone with Mike Minen. Is it a realistic signing? Not really. More so because it looks like he will be heading to Chelsea. But in the past, those two clubs have stolen transfers off each other late. Brentford, know all about Spurs stealing transfers off us late. So if Chelsea don't agree a deal quickly, Spurs could go in, get him for a really cheap price, and he is excellent with the ball at his feet and would really fit that style of play that Thomas Frank wants to play. Looking at the back line, we have Pedro Porro, Van de Ven, Romero and Udogie. It feels harsh to leave out Jed Spence, but realistically, Udogie's not going to get benched when he's fully fit, and Thomas Frank has shown his admiration for Pedro Porro in the past, so I'm not really sure how he fits in, but I do expect him to still play a big part next season. Obviously, with Champions League, there is going to be rotation. Moving on to the midfield, we have Joao Paulinho in there, alongside Lucas Bergvall. Lucas Bergvall, Archie Gray, I expect them to rotate quite a bit. Also players like Pape Sarr, depending on the match. Archie Gray, speaking about him quickly, I'm trying to keep my bitterness away from Archie Gray because, of course, how that transfer worked out to Spurs. But I do think he could play a very important role next season for Thomas Frank. And mainly because if you look at how Brentford have played in the last 10 games, when Yeho Yarmolenko has been playing and Keane Lewis-Potter, of course, traditionally a left winger, but moved back to left back, when Lewis-Potter gets pushed up the pitch to join in the attacks, Yarmolenko steps across and covers that left back role, and that's something that I think Archie Gray could do really well next season at. When Destiny Udogie or Jed Spence pushes up the pitch and joins in the attack, Archie Gray comes across and covers that left back role, which is a role that he himself will play, and then Joao Paulinho can just cover that midfield area because he's such a good player in that role. So that's something that I think that Spurs fans could look forward to next season. So looking at the attack now, we have Brennan Johnson, Dejan Kulusevski, Matthias Tell and Dominic Solanke. There were some rumours that Spurs might try to sign an Eberechi Eze or a Brian Mbeumo. I don't think they will. I don't think they'll spend the money necessary. But they do have players at the club that can fit Thomas Frank's system quite well already. Players like Brennan Johnson, who's Thomas Frank tried to sign at Brentford. So I think that attack looks pretty good. But there are a lot of players in there as well that are missing out that give Thomas Frank such a good depth, which is something he's not really used to having before, because at Brentford, if you lose a couple of key players, you are kind of screwed over, whereas Spurs, last season they went through a major injury crisis, but normal injuries to players, they're not going to feel it as much as you would at Brentford, because look at the bench. James Maddison, Archie Gray, Jed Spence, Kevin Danso, Pape Sarr, Rodrigo Bentancur, Yves Bissouma, so many players there that I think Thomas Frank would do a great job. But let me know, Spurs fans, because I know this has split the Spurs community quite widely. Do you think Frank will be a success at Spurs or a failure? I really do hope he will be a success. I personally believe if he's given the time 2-3 years at Spurs, he will win trophies, Carabao Cup, FA Cup. I do think he will bring that to Spurs, but it's only if he's given the time. With Daniel Levy in charge, I'm not too sure, but let me know. And until next time, Hive out.